Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar, Mastering Your Qualitative Methodology. My name is Rachel. I am a senior research mentor here at Statistics Solutions. I do a lot of the qualitative methodology and design work around here. I am joined by Isades, who is helping me out with the technical end of the webinar today. So she will be here to answer any questions about our services as they come in during the webinar. So again, I'm Rachel, and I am a qualitative mentor here at Statistics Solutions. We are a full service dissertation consulting company, and we are here to help at any stage of your dissertation, from topic development as you're starting to think through what you might be interested in studying, all the way through to your discussion chapter and help with your final defense PowerPoint if you'd like that as well. So our contact information is on this slide, and you will see this again multiple times throughout this presentation. We offer a complimentary consult. If you are interested in talking more about your own specific project and your unique needs, you can go ahead and use that link in the first slide. It'll also be available in the chat. You can email us at info@statisticsolutions.com to get that complimentary consult scheduled. So this afternoon's webinar is Mastering Your Qualitative Methodology. So this is really geared toward a broad discussion of what needs to go into that methods chapter. Okay. And if you're working on sort of a more traditional if you're working on a more traditional 5-chapter dissertation, then that'll probably be your chapter 3. Okay. Although I know that this varies depending on program and school and all of those good things. So if I try to refer to it as the methods chapter, but if I slip and refer to it as chapter 3, know that I'm talking about your methods chapter if you are writing, 6 chapters or 7 chapters in your own dissertation. So if at any time you have questions, you can pop those into the questions box. And what I will do is at the end of today's webinar, we'll have a little time for question and answer. So I will read the questions out loud and get those answered. And as questions come in during the webinar that are more about our services here at Statistics Solutions, Isades will get those answered for you as well. I should also note that everyone will receive a copy of this webinar tomorrow. So if you come in late, or if there's something you want to go back to, that will be available to you. So the overview of your methods chapter, there are sort of some key sections that you are going to want to highlight, to include in this chapter: your introduction, your research design, your role as the researcher, your methodology, issues of trustworthiness, and a summary. And so this is really a compilation of the sections that I see most commonly required of my clients. So it's kind of a compilation that I put together of different schools, guidelines, templates, checklists, sort of all of the above. So some of this may not be applicable to you, your school, your field. That's perfectly fine. But if you're not getting a lot of support in terms of the sort of what do I need to include in this chapter, know that if you hit each of these sections, you will be well prepared. Okay, you'll have everything that you need. So in your introduction, This is where you want to restate your study's purpose. And you do this verbatim. You can literally copy and paste from your first chapter right into your methods chapter. Okay, you restate the purpose. Everywhere that you state your study's purpose, it is the same, okay, verbatim. So you want to think about, and those who have been in my webinars before, I always say you want to think about holding your reader's hand, right? Nothing should be a surprise. Everything should flow logically. And so to do this, then in the introduction, you want to restate upfront, remind the reader what that purpose is. You don't want them to have to go back and sort of shuffle through papers or scroll through pages on the screen to remind themselves at this stage. Okay. And in your introduction, you also preview each of the major sections of the chapter. And so that's kind of what we're talking about in this webinar today. Those sections that I outlined in the previous slide, we'll touch on each of these as we move forward. So the introduction, pretty simple. Restate the purpose of your study, preview the sections of the methods chapter. Your next section will probably be something related to your research design. So in this section, you want to remind your readers of what your research questions are. You want to identify and define the phenomenon to be studied, or if it's a case study, what the case is, the concept, so this terminology will vary a little bit based on the design that you're using. But whatever that concept is that you're studying, you want to talk about that, remind the reader of that. And you want to identify the tradition. So either qualitative or quantitative, and the design. So if it's a case study, if it is a phenomenological study, you want to identify those in this research design section. So one of the things that's important here is that you demonstrate for your reader and for your chair and your dissertation committee that you are familiar with different research designs, both qualitative and quantitative, because your committee wants to see that you understand the right way to address your research questions. Okay, so you need to have a good understanding of what a case study is, what a phenomenological study is, what a quasi-experimental design in a quantitative study is. Okay, and I'm not going to talk about the quantitative here. That's another webinar, and we do provide those. This is just the qualitative. But as a budding researcher, you do need to be able to show that you know all of these designs. Okay, because you have to justify why the design that you chose is the most appropriate for your research. Okay, so let me back up a minute and say your research design, everything that goes into your methods chapter, follows from your research problem and your research purpose. Okay, it doesn't go the other direction. You don't set out to, conduct a qualitative study or conduct a quantitative study. That's not how research works. You identify the problem, you develop the purpose, you develop your research questions, and the design follows from that. Okay. So you need to be familiar with those designs and justify why that design is going to get you the answers to your research question that will address the problem and the purpose. So the case for using a qualitative design, again, as I said, ultimately, the case for using a qualitative design comes from your problem and your purpose. That is the sole reason that you would conduct a qualitative study. Okay. So if it makes sense to use a qualitative design, this is good for if you're working with textual data, if you are conducting interviews with participants, you're interested in their stories, okay, how they tell their stories. You might be conducting observations of an organization, of a classroom. You might be getting into some kind of historic work, document analysis, okay? Textual data, words, qualitative design, okay? Qualitative designs are helpful for understanding participants' perspectives on experiences that they've gone through in their lives, okay? Qualitative designs rely pretty heavily on data collection methods like interviews and focus groups, where you're directly asking questions of participants. Like I said, you might rely on documents and some kind of document analysis. Maybe they are historical documents. Maybe you are investigating a new curriculum plan. And so it would make sense to look at curriculum documents, lesson plans, things like that. Maybe you're interested in how that curriculum is being implemented in the classroom. And so it makes sense to do observations, to conduct observations. So different data collection techniques that you can use in qualitative studies. Okay, and the goal is not necessarily to generalize your findings. Oftentimes you won't be able to, and that's just fine. Okay, that isn't the goal. Whereas, in quantitative studies, you might be looking for that a little bit more. You're not hypothesis testing. So unlike quantitative studies, in qualitative studies, we don't set up a null or alternative hypothesis. We use research questions. There are no hypotheses that we're testing, and there's no real need to quantify your results in a qualitative design. Some studies, you can certainly do this. If it makes sense for your study, then that's great, but that's not always the case. Okay, so you don't necessarily need to quantify your results. I do want to talk a little bit about a couple of qualitative research designs that I see pretty commonly, and then just a couple of designs that are sort of less common that I see amongst my clients. So a case study is very common, as is phenomenological studies. And the generic qualitative design is also really helpful. I occasionally see grounded theory and ethnography, although these are pretty specific to certain disciplines and also in their application as well. So most often it's a case study, phenomenological study, or generic study. So let's talk a little bit more about each of these. A case study is really helpful for looking at one thing and one thing only, one case, okay, in this really in-depth analysis of that case. So it might be it might be a case that is atypical, okay, whereas we normally see one thing in, say, third grade classrooms, but in one school, there's something different going on. We want to explore why. Okay, it might be an exemplary case. So one that really kind of defines what that case is. Case might provide a counterpoint, okay, new way of thinking about that case, about that example, a new direction for research, right? But the key is really here that you're looking at this in-depth case, okay? And it's bounded. So another way of thinking about it is delimited by certain characteristics, okay? So, if we go back to, you're looking at maybe some new curriculum implementation in a third grade classroom, then if you're doing a single case study, and I'm not going to, really go in depth into single versus multiple here, but if you're doing a single case study, then that case is bound by that classroom. That case is the classroom. So it's everything that's in the classroom, and it's nothing that is outside of the classroom. So if you're doing a multiple case study, then you might have 3 different classrooms. Each of those is a case, okay? And they all have this uniting factor, okay? Case studies are conducted using multiple data collection methods. It's very rare that you would conduct a case study and only collect data through interviews. So you might have interviews, you might have a focus group or 2, you might conduct a document analysis. Okay, multiple data collection methods, because again, the goal is the in-depth analysis to generate a rich description of the case or the cases, if it's a multiple case study, and examine the themes that emerge from the study of that case or those cases, the patterns there. Okay, so really, really in-depth look at one thing or, a multiple case study. So a case study could be one single case. It could be one single human, one participant. Okay, but you have to sort of decide that based on the context of your study and what makes sense, again, based on the problem and the purpose. Phenomenological studies are also very common. They come from, they're rooted in really philosophy, and then also are very psychological in nature. And so I see these a lot, but please remember that they are pretty specific in terms of the psychology behind them. So they are most helpful if you are investigating the lived experiences of participants. Okay, so how participants make meaning of an experience. So it's not just how do participants experience something, right? It's more than that. You're getting deeper into the meaning making behind that. And this happens through in-depth interviews. Okay, and when I say in-depth, I mean, you will probably sit down for a couple of hours at a time with participants to talk about their experiences. Okay, and the goal is really to understand the essence of that experience, the commonalities of that experience. So what is shared amongst everyone who has been through that experience. Okay, and it's done using psychological terminology as well, which is why I really want to drive this home, because I do see it misapplied pretty frequently. Okay, because it is so psychological in nature. It's not a case of, I want to just conduct interviews, so I will do a phenomenological study. That's not how this works. Okay. It has to do with the psychology and the meaning making behind an experience. So you might be thinking, okay, well, that's great, but if a case study is this and a phenomenological study is that, and my study doesn't really meet those requirements, then where do I fit? Well, I've got a generic qualitative design for you. So this is a great option if your study has elements of a case study or a phenomenological study, and it just doesn't fit real squarely within either of those other options, okay, or any other qualitative design for that matter. I think that generic qualitative designs get a bad rap because I think that we have a negative association with the term generic, and that is absolutely incorrect in this case. These are easily justifiable. Okay. So if your chair or your committee, if you have a committee member that doesn't think it's sort of good enough, you can justify this really easily. There's a lot of literature about generic qualitative designs. Okay. It's just that it's helpful when, you might be, like in a phenomenological study, interested in participants' experiences, but you're not as interested in sort of how they understood it and made meaning out of it. Okay. You're not interested in that sort of reflection, the inner world of that experience. Okay. So you may use this with a mixed methods approach where you pull in a quantitative component. Again, it has to make sense within the problem and the purpose of your study. But this is a really good, solid design because it is so flexible. Okay. It allows you to determine what is or what makes the most sense for your study. Does it make sense to do interviews? Does it make sense to have participants fill out a questionnaire or conduct written or oral surveys? Okay. So you can see that some of the data collection techniques are, again, similar to phenomenology or case study. It's just that the goal is a little bit different here. And so if the goal doesn't fit, the purpose doesn't fit within the case study or the phenomenology, then I encourage you to explore generic qualitative design. Less commonly, I see grounded theory studies. Grounded theory is great when there's not a whole lot known about a topic and you as a researcher are interested in generating theory based off of experience. So that's why this is called grounded theory. It's that the theory are grounded in your data. So you don't actually start off with a research question as such. You don't start off with a theoretical framework because you're looking to develop that theory. Okay. And it's done through, again, really similar, it's conducted through similar mechanisms that we've already seen. Interviews, maybe conducting some field work, okay, where you're actually sort of maybe living with or working alongside your participants, text and document analysis, a lot of memoing or writing about what you're learning from your participants, and theoretical saturation. So, really continuing this data collection and analytic process until you are not seeing new trends emerge in your data. Okay. So again, this is good if your goal is to develop theory or produce a broad explanation of a process or an action or an interaction. Okay. Something that we don't know a whole lot about yet. This can be very, very helpful. When I say that this is not for novice researchers, I mean it. And this comes from my experience as well as others. So I tend to steer doctoral students away from grounded theory. It is very time consuming, both, it's time consuming. It can be financially consuming because it does take so long. Okay. Because the process is data collection and analysis at the same time. You're constantly going back and forth between data analysis, collection, data analysis, collection, until you hit this theoretical saturation point. And so that can take a lot of time. Okay. The other that I see less frequently, but I do still see occasionally, is ethnography. And this really is kind of unique within, it's unique within the discipline of anthropology. And then also sociology makes use of ethnographic work as well. This is really helpful when we want to understand a problem within a particular social or cultural context. Okay, so it's really a holistic inquiry. We're looking at networks and groupings of people and institutions, social groups, and it is also conducted using interviews and conversations with people, but really the hallmark of ethnography is this participant observation and extended field work. And when I say extended, I mean that historically we're talking about several years. worth of time. This isn't always the case anymore. You can do good ethnography in shorter periods of time, absolutely. But, the expectation for ethnographic research still is around a year of data collection. And so for that reason, it can be, again, both, time consuming as well as financially consuming as well. But if your goal is to produce this in-depth account of the research problem in the cultural context, and from the perspective of participants, sort of this walking in their shoes, then this could be a really good approach. Okay, a really good design. But again, as I've said before, for any of these designs, they have to make sense for your problem and your purpose. So first you establish the problem, then you develop the purpose, and then comes your research design. So you'll have a section after your research design section on your role as the researcher. Okay. So, are you, and I apologize for the typo right here at the top of the page, just is life. But you want to think through what your own role as the researcher is. Okay. Are you an observer? Are you a participant? Are you both? Okay. Different research requires different things. So, as the researcher, where do you fit in? Right? Part of this is going to have to do with any conflicts of interest that you might have with your participants or power dynamics. Okay. So, you want to really be aware of identifying and describing, if you are studying, say, in your place of work and you're working with colleagues, are there any power dynamics there? Are you in a position of power over them? Okay. And so you want to talk about those in this section. You also want to talk in this section about potential areas of bias and how you will mitigate these. So all researchers have some bias toward the topic. That's how it works. And I am going to argue until the end of time that quantitative studies are no different. Okay. Everything that we do involves, human beings. And, if we're in the social sciences, right, we're working with humans. So there's going to be some level of bias there. The best that we can do is identify what these areas of bias are and how we will mitigate these. Okay. So you talk about that in this section as well. And identify any other applicable ethical issues that might arise. Do you work at the study site? Again, are you studying your own organization? What are the ethical implications of doing that? Okay. And this is where you describe those in this section. You will also include a section on your participants. Okay. So this can be in a sort of larger section on your methodology or the sort of written instructions for how you will conduct your research. So your participants, the population, what group of people will you draw your sample from? Okay, what's the overall group of people that you're looking at? Are you looking at all third grade teachers? Is the population all third grade teachers in the United States, for example? And then you identify your sampling strategy. So non-random sampling, purposive sampling is most common in qualitative research, because again, if we're looking at commonality of experience, it doesn't make sense to really diversify our sample. Okay, we want people who have the same characteristics so that we know that they've all been through the same experience. Okay, so you delineate these in your inclusion and exclusion criteria. So you want to think about this in terms of what are the characteristics that people must meet to participate in your study. Okay. Exclusion criteria are if your participant, if an individual meets all of your inclusion criteria, what would still exclude them from participating in your study? Okay. And then you also want to describe how you will verify that interested parties, potential participants, meet those inclusion criteria. Okay. So how you'll verify that. The number of participants in your study. And if you're doing a case study, the number of cases. Okay. And, you know, again, this all needs to be justified in the literature. So if you are conducting a case study, you want to look at the literature on case studies. You want to look at the researchers who have conducted case studies, ideally case studies that are maybe similar in topic to your own, so that you could build a really solid case for why this makes sense for your own study. Okay. You will identify the steps that you will use to identify, contact, and recruit your participants. Okay. How do you know your participants? How will you find them? Who's helping you, if anyone? What organization is helping you, if any organization? And then the size of the sample and data saturation. So how will you know that your data are saturated? Okay. And that's the point when you are not really learning anything new with further data collection attempts. Okay. The next section of the methodology should have something to do with your instrumentation. So all data collection instruments that you are using, your interview protocol, your systematic observation sheets, systematic document analysis sheets, for any type of data you are going to collect, you will include a discussion of that instrument. Okay. The source for those instruments. So are you using something that is already created, something that's already published? And if you are, that's perfectly fine. You do need to have permission, written permission to do that. Okay. So you'll talk about that here. If you're creating your own, say, interview protocol, that's perfectly fine too. But this is where you talk about that and how you developed your interview protocol. And it will probably be based on your literature review. Okay. You want to identify the source of any documents that you might be using and how you verify their accuracy. Demonstrate how each data source will help you address your research questions. Okay, so you do that for each data collection instrument. So one for each data source. There should also be a subsection about your procedures for participant recruitment, participation, and data collection. So for the instrumentation section, you know, you've outlined the different instruments that you're using. Interview protocol, observation sheet. Okay, so for each of those in this section, you want to explain where the data will be collected, who will be collecting those data. So oftentimes it's you, but perhaps you are in a program where you are lucky enough to have a research assistant. And maybe some of you are laughing like, yeah, right. You know, that would never happen. And I totally understand that feeling too, but some people do have research assistants. And so maybe they're the person that's collecting the data. And that's perfectly fine. So you talk about that here. Frequency of data collection events. So is this something that, are you conducting 3 observations of each classroom over the course of 6 weeks? And if so, talk about that. Or are you just doing it once? Okay. The duration of those data collection events. So how long will you spend observing classrooms? How long will you spend interviewing participants? How are you going to record your data? And any contingency plans. Okay. There's always some loss to attrition in any study. So how will you ensure that you end up with the sample that you wanted? Okay, that you outlined at the beginning. If people leave, how will you recruit more participants? Okay. And then any follow-up procedures that you're using. So if you're conducting transcript verification with your participants, once you have their interviews transcribed, how will you conduct that follow-up? If you are having participants conduct a member check, so after you've analyzed the data and you have, a written summary of those results, you present those to your participants and ask them questions about how well your results, capture their experience. Okay, so that's the member checking. So any of those follow-up procedures you want to talk about here. And then your data analysis plan as well. So for each type of data that you are collecting, how are those data going to address the research questions? And what are your procedures for analyzing those? Okay, and I do have another webinar for those interested. I don't go into data analysis in this webinar. That's not within the scope of this, but there is another webinar on data analysis for those of you who are interested. Okay, so definitely check that out on our website because that is available. It's just not covered here. If you're using any software in the data analysis, how will you use that? How will you handle discrepant cases or those cases that don't seem to fit the pattern of other participants? Okay, so let's say most of your participants all sort of had the same experience with a phenomenon, but someone else experienced it very, very differently. How does that factor in to the analysis? And so you'll talk about that. The next section then should be on how you establish trustworthiness. So this is, this is like reliability in quantitative studies. We talk about trustworthiness instead in qualitative studies. And there are 4 kind of different factors of establishing trustworthiness and how we do this. And so there's credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. And so credibility is sort of our confidence in how accurate our findings are. Okay, do they reflect the real world? Transferability means, are the results applicable to different contexts? If you used a different participant group or if you used a different organization, maybe. Dependability refers to consistency of findings. So with further studies using the same design and methodology, can this study be replicated? Can we find the same things, right? And then confirmability. So are your findings based on what your participants said and not sort of yourself as the researcher, right? Are your findings rooted in the data? Okay, so there are different ways to establish this. And in this section of your methods chapter, you talk about how you will establish trustworthiness. So some examples that I have for each of these: triangulation, rich description, audit trail, member checking. The one thing that I do want to be clear about for each of these examples is they're not mutually exclusive. Something like triangulation can be really helpful for establishing, different facets of trustworthiness, not just credibility, but it can also be, helpful for transferability, for example, or confirmability. Okay, so this is where you talk about how you'll establish trustworthiness. And then you should have a section about your ethical procedures. Again, assuming we're working with human subjects, we need some ethical procedures in place. So you talk about any agreements to gain access to participants. So if there are site permissions that you need, for example, you're conducting a study in a school, then you would need permission. Organization, you would need permission. You will need permission from your institutional review board or your IRB before you can even start collecting data, before you even contact possible participants. You need to have all of these permissions in place. Okay. Talk about making sure that you are upholding the ethical procedures and principles of the Belmont report, is really what it comes down to. So ethical considerations for recruiting participants, making sure that that is equitable. Okay. Everyone who is who meets your inclusion criteria has equal opportunity to participate in the research. Ethical considerations about data collection, where you are collecting data, ensuring that your data remain confidential and can't be linked back to the participant. Treatment of data. So anonymity versus confidentiality. I see these confused a lot, which is why I want to mention this here because it is important. Anonymity would mean that you don't know your participants at all. Okay. And this is really not something that we see in qualitative research. Maybe in a quantitative study where you're conducting a survey that is distributed through, some third-party platform online, you wouldn't have any idea of who your participants are, so they would be anonymous to you. But in qualitative research, we don't really have this luxury. Okay, our participants are not anonymous to us. So what we have to do is maintain confidentiality, which is where we do know them, but we need to protect them and make sure that nobody else knows who they are. Okay. So making sure that you're conducting an interview with someone in a private location, making sure that you are approaching someone to participate in your study in a way such that no one else knows sort of what you're doing and that they might be agreeing to participate in your study in front of other people. Okay. How you will secure your data. So each university has a different amount of time. Okay, it's most often 5 years, but again, this is something you need to check with your university and your department. You will have to maintain your data securely, confidentially for that period of time. Okay, and so this is, we're talking about in locked offices, in locked filing cabinets, on password protected encrypted computers, all of this to make sure that no one can access those data and figure out who your participants are. The final section is the summary. And like every other summary section of any other chapter, you want to present a recap of the main points, right? So you're pulling the reader along. Okay, always go back to this idea of holding the reader's hand through the chapter. Okay, and remember the order: problem and purpose, and research questions and methods and methodology. Okay, it doesn't go the other way. So you identify the problem, you establish the purpose, and then you work out your research question and your design. And then transition to the next chapter, which most likely will be your results chapter. Okay, and for those who are interested, I have another webinar on confidently presenting your results, which you are more than welcome to attend. I encourage you to attend, where we sort of go through everything that should be in that results chapter, similar to this webinar. Okay, just for the results chapter, so you can ensure that you've hit each section that you need to present in your results chapter. So just some other, tips and tricks for working on your results chapter. Okay, so we have all of the sections, the subsections kind of outlining, what you need to do. And in some ways it's very plug and chug, right? It's here's the section, here's what needs to go in it. You just write it down. Okay, and make sure that you're justifying all of your decisions based on your study and then the literature and other researchers. But this chapter can be challenging because you are thinking and planning for something that you haven't done yet. Okay, and that's why this really trips clients that I work with up. Okay, because it's a lot of what ifs, right? And you can't get hung up on the what ifs. Okay, so, just allow yourself to be okay with things might not go as you outline in this chapter. So take your first two chapters, your introduction chapter and your literature review chapter. Start with the problem and the purpose and the research questions, and ask yourself these questions. What data do I need to answer these? Who do I need to talk to find the answers? What documents will give me the answers? What observations will give me the answers? Okay, it's really, what do I need to address the research questions? Okay, start there. And do that. If you have multiple research questions, do that for each research question. Okay. Think of this as a recipe. So you have two parts, right? You have your ingredients and you have your instructions. The design is the ingredients. The methodology is the instructions. Okay. If you get a recipe for, I love lemon pound cake. Okay. It's one of my favorite foods. And you just get the ingredients, and maybe you even get the amount of ingredients, but you don't get the instructions, that lemon pound cake is going to flop. And that's a real bummer, right? Because we love lemon pound cake. You have to have the instructions too. So ingredients and instructions. Here's what you're going to do. Here's how you're going to do it. Okay. That's really the key to this chapter. But the other key is this. Okay. And this is what I really want to leave you with. Your plans are going to change. Your research exists in the real world. And especially right now, because we are in the middle of a global pandemic, and I have said this in just about every webinar I have given for the last year. So if you have joined me in other webinars, you've heard me say this. Things change, okay? Life is wild right now. And this is where students get hung up with the what if. You know, I'm planning my design this way, but what if something happens? Well, what if something does happen? You know what? You're going to change it, and that's fine. It's totally fine. You work with what you have right now. Everybody who has written a dissertation and collected data in the last year, I guarantee has had to change their research design and methods. Okay. Because, you know, we can't sit down even to interview people one-on-one in person anymore. So at a minimum, that's going to change how you conduct your interviews or your focus groups. It's fine. Okay. Think of your methods chapter as the expectation chapter, and think of your results chapter as the reality, because in your results chapter, you will revisit what you said you were going to do in your methods chapter. And in your results chapter, this is where you talk about how everything changed, or maybe how only one thing changed, but how anything changed. Okay. So don't get hung up, is my point, on the what if things change. Expect something to change, because this is life and we're humans and we're working with humans. Okay. Something will change. That's fine. But know that you address that later on in your results chapter. You talk about it perhaps in your discussion chapter as a limitation, and you move on with your life and you finish your results chapter so that you can get onto IRB and collect data. Okay. If you are still struggling with your methods and your design, we are here to help. So again, my name is Rachel. I am a senior qualitative mentor, research analyst here at Statistics Solutions. And we together as a company are a full service dissertation consulting company. And we are here to help you through this process, no matter where you are in the process. Okay. If you're a qualitative researcher, if you're a quantitative researcher, there are people here to help you. We will help you get through in a timely manner. We know that, you know, clients most often come to us when they're sort of, you know, at the end of the line and just want to get done and just need to get done, right? We're here to help. You don't have to wait until you're at that point. Okay. You don't have to spend the money. So we do provide a complimentary consultation during our business hours to talk more about your own unique dissertation needs. Okay. To help us get a better sense of where you are, the challenges that you are encountering as you're working on your dissertation, and how we can help. So you can use this contact information to get that scheduled. I believe it's also in the chat box as well. You can self-schedule to talk with us about your own situation. Okay. we are here to help, right? So that's the end of the webinar. I'm going to open up the questions. Box right now. Let's see. So I will just answer these in the order that they came in during the webinar. And get those answered. So the first question is, can we use a focus group for a case study? The answer is yes, if it makes sense for your study, your problem, and your purpose, and your research questions, then, you know, certainly a focus group can be used as part of a case study design. Let's see. I have a question about some confusion between case study and phenomenological study. Already received doctorate, did a case study, interviewed teachers, principals, parents, community partners, board of directors, wanted to understand and examine the community partnership program that the school implemented and how it influenced the social, emotional, and academic needs of the whole child. No, I think you were probably right in going the case study route for that one. Yeah, phenomenological study is more, like I said, it's a lot more psychological, in nature. So I think this one is sort of related, an overlap between case study and phenomenological study. No, it's not that there's an overlap so much. I mean, they really do two different things. You know, the case study is really focused on one or more multiple, you know, cases for this really in-depth look at sort of what and how, whereas phenomenological is the meaning making of experiences, okay, how a phenomenon is experienced. In the role of the researcher section, should that be a required section that's included in every researcher's dissertation? I don't believe that I had a section when I wrote my dissertation. I believe that it absolutely should be included. This is, again, you know, it is both my professional opinion, but it is also my personal opinion, because I, you know, I'm really, I believe that research is subjective. I believe that all research is subjective. There is, I don't believe in sort of an objective reality that is out there. And so I think it's important that we talk about ourselves in relation to our research. But I also think, I'm an anthropologist by training, and, you know, we're so actively involved in our research that I really think, you know, we influence our research no matter what. So I think it is important that we just acknowledge that, you know, and that's fine. Let's see. What is the process to develop introduction section and research questions for a systematic literature review with respect to qualitative research? What types of statistics do we need to have in it? So, you know, if you're looking at a systematic literature review, you would probably want to look at something more like a content analysis for a systematic literature review. You know, these are, they tend to be more quantitative in nature. In terms of statistics you would need to have in it, we don't deal with the statistics in qualitative research. So that would be a question that's maybe a little bit better geared for one of our quantitative webinars. But, you know, you could do a content analysis, you could do a thematic analysis for a systematic literature review. But, you know, statistics would be sort of not part of that process in the qualitative. another one mentioning that, yes, things will always change as you progress through your study. Yeah, I mean, that's really sort of uh, that that's the key. They will change. Don't be afraid of that. It's just embrace it, go with it. It happens. Everybody else is in the same situation. It's totally fine. The process of developing interview protocols, some resources that might be helpful. I mean, I think I'm struggling for like names of authors right now, but I think um, any good kind of qualitative research author, Cresswell, Plano Clark, would have information on how to develop that interview protocol. But it's really, I think that what I recommend to my clients is sitting down with your research questions and saying, okay, so what do I need to ask of my participants to get the answers that will ultimately address the problem, purpose, and research questions? So, we don't interview with our research questions, but you want to think about how all of that aligns. I think it can be really helpful to sit down and kind of make a table, like an alignment table, to think through some of those questions. The other thing that I would suggest for interview protocols is that it really helps to begin with something that we call a grand tour question. And these questions are, kind of like, tell me everything you know about, whatever the phenomenon is, right? So from there, you can kind of whittle down and get more and more specific in the topic, but starting really broadly with what is the kind of overview of your participants' understanding and funneling it down from there can really help. I have a question about equivalent to power analysis. So the equivalent, I mean, there's not an equivalent in qualitative research. There's not an equivalent to power analysis in qualitative research. But what you want to aim for is data saturation. And it looks like you've got another question about this here in a minute, about data saturation. So I will kind of do a twofer here. The data saturation is not confined necessarily to a local, national, or international data collection. It's the point at which, for whatever your sample is, okay, based on your inclusion and exclusion criteria, it is with more data collection. So let's say that you have a sample of 12 participants and you interview all 12 and you're analyzing your data and you realize that after the 9th participant, you aren't learning anything new from participant 10, 11, or 12 about that phenomenon. Then you can say that your data are saturated. You sort of learned everything about your data, about the topic, about the phenomenon that you are probably going to learn. So that would be as close to an equivalent of power analysis as we sort of talk about here. I have a question from another participant about program development to solve a social problem. Would it make sense to use the model as a case study? Yes, I think that would be an appropriate case study, is sort of looking at, almost like a monitoring and evaluation kind of situation, looking at the model as the case, how it's working, right? Really in depth, sort of what's going on with that, I think would be appropriate. let's see. So, okay, I've got a couple more questions. I will get through these because I can get through them pretty quickly, but I'm not taking any more at this point. Could you compare and contrast when you would do a case study or phenomenological study versus when you would do a generic qualitative design? Yes. So if you are, maybe you're interested in someone's experience with a phenomenon. Okay. And I use that term really broadly, just really someone's experience of going through something, maybe would be a much easier kind of plain way of saying this. And you're interested in what that was like, but you're maybe not interested in how they made sense of it, right? Sort of the meaning that they attached to it. Then, it's not really phenomenological. But a case study, you might be, so I guess with a case study, it may be that, you're not necessarily looking at this one kind of in-depth case. Okay. You want to broaden the topic a little bit more. So it's not quite a case study, but it would still maybe make sense to use, say, different types of data collection. Then a generic qualitative design could come in handy. So, if you're sort of looking through different researchers, both case study researchers and also phenomenological researchers, and you're like, some of this really makes sense for my study, but not all of it makes sense. That is kind of the telltale, generic qualitative design. Or if you're thinking that interviews are going to be the most useful and you don't necessarily have to collect data, but just because you're only doing interviews, it doesn't make it a phenomenological study, right? So then maybe a generic qualitative design could be most helpful. Qualitative descriptive studies can also work, can also be very helpful. This is when you're more looking for the description of an event. So yes, I do, and I'm seeing more and more actually qualitative descriptive studies, clients coming in with those. So that's another good option. Let's see. Can you do a case study design, but with a phenomenological approach at the same time? Boy, to me, they're just really different things. They're just very different studies. So I think if you are looking at the meaning making and sort of the psychology, really what I go to when I'm thinking about this is the psychology behind it. Okay. So if there's that aspect, then it's probably a phenomenological study. So I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to answer this question entirely, but if my topic is alternative education, the characteristics of established programs that benefit at-risk students, which methodology would you suggest? You're thinking phenomenology. This to me says more case study approach, because you're looking at the what and the how of these established programs that are benefiting at-risk students. And so you're looking at sort of how they're benefiting at-risk students, what they're doing, right? Then I think a case study would probably be the most appropriate for this. And then let's see. Final question. If you're working with 3 schools, is each school a case? Not necessarily. So you want to look at the literature. It could be, it depends on the sort of unit of analysis. So if it's the case, then it could be that each school is a case. Okay, but it could be that it's sort of one case and you're looking at 3 different schools in there, it's going to have to do with, sort of what are you comparing and contrasting across all of those. Okay, we are a little bit over time, so I am sorry to have kept you. I really appreciate your attendance today. I hope that this was helpful. Do stay tuned, hit our website for a bunch of other great resources. We have blog posts. You can, again, schedule your complimentary consultation to talk more about your own needs. And we've got other webinars, our webinar schedule for everything that's coming up that we've got planned in the future for the next quarter. There's a lot of great information there at statisticsolutions.com. So thanks everyone for your participation this afternoon. I appreciate it. Take care. Bye-bye.